If you've got a Bible, and I hope that you do, go ahead and grab it, and we're going to be in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 13. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. No one's getting married this morning, but we are going to be perusing through 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And my hope is that by the time we finish the 13th chapter of the book of 1 Corinthians, you'll never see it as a wedding text ever again. Okay, that's my hope this morning. I'm going to start with an excerpt from a book entitled It Is Finished, 365 Days of Good News by Tullian Tchividjian. And one of the first chapters here in the book, he tells a story of his good friend, Dr. Rod Rosenblatt. And this is how it goes. Dr. Rod Rosenblatt told me the story of how he had wrecked his car when he was 16 years old after he and his friends had been drinking. Following the accident, Rod called his dad, and the first thing his dad asked him was, "Are you all right?" Rod said, "Yes." Then he confessed to his father that he was drunk. Rod was naturally terrified about how his father might respond. Later that night, after Rod had made it home, he wept and wept in his father's study. He was embarrassed, ashamed. At the end of the ordeal, his father asked him this question: "How about tomorrow we go and get you a new car?" Rod now says that he became a Christian in that moment. God's grace became real to him in that moment of forgiveness and mercy. Now nearly 70 years old, Rod has since spent his life as a spokesman for the theology of grace. Rod's father's grace didn't turn Rod into a drunk. It made him love his father and the Lord he served. Now, let me ask you, what would you like to say to Rod's dad? Rod says that every time he tells that story in public, there are always people in the audience who get angry. They say, "Your dad let you get away with that? He didn't punish you at all? What a great opportunity for your dad to teach you responsibility." Rod always chuckles when he hears that response and says, "Do you think I didn't know what I had done? Do you think it wasn't the most painful moment of my whole life up to that point? I was ashamed. I was scared. My father spoke grace to me in a moment when I deserved wrath, and I came alive." I want you to imagine a second scenario with me this morning, a second story. It's probably not too far-fetched. You guys know I'm a rebel by nature. Let's imagine that I decided to rob a bank. Okay? And I gathered around me four of my accomplices, four of my buddies, and we plotted it all out, and we planned, and we had our getaway vehicle, and we had our tools for the bank robbery, and we showed up on the day of the robbery outside of one of the banks here in Clearwater, the biggest bank in Clearwater, and we're about to go in, and we've got our ski mask on, we've got our weapons in hand, and all of a sudden Mike, who prayed this morning, Mike is, he's walking down the street corner, or walks around the street corner, walking down the street, and he sees me there. He's like, "Bro, what are you doing?" I'm like, "Well, if I'm honest with you, I'm trying to be honest. Like, I'm about to rob this bank, about to knock it off. They don't need the money. Insurance will cover. It's all good." He's like, no, this is a terrible idea, Aaron. It's a terrible idea. I know you like to push the boundaries, but this is too far, okay? You've gone too far this time. Don't rob this bank. Don't do this. I'm like, "My buddies now, we've already planned it all out. We're going to do this thing. I want the money. I want the cash. We're going to get away with it." He's like, "You're not going to get away with it. You're not as smart. You're not as clever. You're not as brilliant as you think you are. You're not going to get away with it." And I'm like, "Well, I don't really care what you have to say." And so I turn to follow my buddies into the bank, and Mike tackles me. That would not be that hard for him to do. He's a beast, and I'm not. He tackles me, smatters me to the ground, and holds me. I'm kicking and screaming and clawing and fighting and trying to escape from him. And he's holding me, pinning me there to the ground while my buddies knock off this bank, get away with the money, and weeks later are arrested and spend their lives in prison. And so one of you comes to me and says, "Why aren't you in prison?" And my response, "Because I didn't rob the bank." And if we're not careful, I think that's the testament of far too many of us when it comes to our salvation testimony. Why are you accepted? Because the gospel of grace never begins with those words. It's because Mike pinned me to the ground. Kicking and clawing and screaming and fighting and rebelling. That's why I'm not in prison. The reason that we are not condemned is not because it's because God, rich in mercy, came to us and saved you from yourself. That's what he did. And so what happens is, we've been progressing through this series we called Foundations where we're exploring together what it means for us to believe and follow and espouse and function as followers of Christ, both individually here and collectively together. And this morning, we're going to move from kind of the vertical dimension. The first 3 weeks, we talked about vertical realities between us and the Lord, right? That we are supposed to be, as his followers, as his people, Christ-centered, gospel-driven, that we are supposed to be scripture-reliant. We've talked about all 3 of these the last 3 weeks. That there is no gospel without Christ. That there is no Christ without scripture, like biblically defined. But now we begin to shift this week to the horizontal dimension of our faith. But as we shift, please hear me say this, we cannot lose sight, once again, as Vince prayed, of the radicality of our faith, of grace demonstrated and gifted to us by God himself that qualifies us here this morning. Nothing, like the hymn says, nothing in our hands we bring, simply to the cross we cling. That's it. And if we are going to live as messengers, ambassadors of grace in this world, we must constantly keep before our minds that it was not I, but it was Christ in me that qualifies me, brings me to this point, and now the demonstration of grace to the world is that he has saved us according to his favor, according to his power, according to his brilliance, according to his strength, and that we are qualified in him. And so therefore, it's not, once again, I know you get this, it's not that we're going to love others and we're going to bestow grace upon others in order to get grace back from God, but it's that we're going to try or strive and fail at times. We're going to try to love others and to bestow grace upon them because he has already been so lovingly gracious toward us. So let's keep that before our minds this morning. And as we do, we're here in the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 13, as a people of grace, and all that means is that we haven't gotten from him what we deserved. We've gotten from him what Christ deserved, because Christ got what we deserved. And so now, from that reality, the reality of grace, we hear Paul writing a chapter that is not about marriage. And it can be applied to marriage for sure. But the reason, hear me say this, the reason why we've taken 1 Corinthians 13 and applied it to marriage, and you hear it in ceremonies all the time, is because this is such a heightened form of love. The quality of love carries with it such a gravitas in this chapter that it's easy for us to go, there's only one relationship in all the world, humanly speaking, that could possibly attain this. And Paul's like, no, you're getting it wrong. Marriage should try to attain this, but so too should every single one of us as followers of Christ with one another. So here's what he says, 1 Corinthians 13. And I'm reading, people keep asking, you guys keep asking, I appreciate you asking. I'm reading from the Christian Standard Bible, so I've been preaching from. And so if you want to grab one of those, you can, or you follow on your phone. But it's not too far off from the NIV or the ESV, but it says this. Verse 1, chapter 13, if I speak human or angelic tongues, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy, and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so that I can move mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. And if I give away all my possessions, and if I give over my body in order to boast, or many translations say to be burned, those go hand in hand there. So it's basically saying, I would willingly give my life for Christ. There's a boasting in that. But do not have love, I gain nothing. Verse 4, love is patient, kind. Love does not envy, it is not boastful. It is not arrogant, it is not rude, it is not self-seeking, it is not irritable, and does not keep a record of wrongs. Love finds no joy in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put aside childish things. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully as I am fully known. Now these three remain, faith, hope, love, but the greatest of these is love. All right. So as you study this text, a text clearly to a incredibly messy, distorted, jacked up church, there are three aspects of Christian love that rise up, or through three dimensions, I guess you would say, and we're going to explore those together this morning. The first dimension, really, if you're taking notes, you can write this down, is the absolute necessity of Christian love. Like, it's an absolute necessity. So don't miss this. The city of Corinth was situated on this isthmus, which was a narrow peninsula stretching between the Ionian Sea and the Aegean Sea. And on this isthmus, it was a colossal trade route. There was a military outpost because whoever controlled this isthmus, this peninsula, basically controlled these two significant waterways directly in between ancient Athens and ancient Sparta. So significant was the city of Corinth. And there were, of course, there was the god Apollo. That was one of the premier temples there in the city of Corinth. But also, chief among the deities in Corinth was Aphrodite, the goddess of sexuality, fertility, and beauty. And the Corinthians worshiped her. They loved her. And high up on the hill overlooking, I know it's going to be a little washed out this morning because of the lights, but I've got a picture here of Acro-Corinth. That's the ruins in our day. So down in the basin below there, butted up against the Aegean, you'll see the city of Corinth, or at least the ruins of the ancient city of Corinth there on the isthmus, stretching toward the far west. And then you've got here Acro-Corinth, and this is where the temple of Aphrodite, it's just in ruins now, the temple of this goddess of beauty and sex and fertility would be. And every evening as the Corinthians came home from their work, what they would hear is the clatter of bells, the crashing of cymbals. And this was the Corinthian call to worship, primarily the call to come and to worship the goddess Aphrodite. And what would happen is more than 1,000 temple prostitutes would descend from the Acro-Corinth, from the temple of Aphrodite, into the streets and marketplaces among the neighborhoods of Corinth. And they would seduce and they would woo male and female prostitutes of male and female, heterosexual and homosexual relationship. They would woo them up to Acro-Corinth, where there they could, in open sexuality and orgy, worship the goddess Aphrodite. And they would ring these cymbals that they found, archaeological excavations have found, that was bronze overlaid with tin. And when the Corinthians would hear these cymbals, they knew it was time to worship. But as the believers had now exited that lifestyle and come to faith in Christ, they realized that the call to worship Aphrodite was an empty call. There was no power in Aphrodite. There was no reason to worship this goddess of sexuality. Like I said, Corinth is situated on an isthmus here. And so it was oftentimes attacked from the outside world. And when ships would come, when an army would form, they would hear the clanging of the gongs resound throughout the city. And that clanging of the gongs would stoke fear in the hearts of the inhabitants, but it would rally the forces to battle. So what Paul does brilliantly, he does this all the time, is he draws on those two analogies, those two realities that all the Corinthians would have known. The clashing of the cymbals, the clanging of the gongs. And he says to them in the church at Corinth, messy, jacked up, broken church, he says to them, if you speak with all the rhetoric of Athens, or this is a church clearly that was completely captivated by the spiritual gifts. So he goes on to say, or even if you speak with the tongues of angels, and there's a lot of dispute over what that means exactly, but this angelic tongue, at the very least, would carry with it a greater dimension of spirituality. So if you know all the rhetoric of Athens and of the ancient world, you speak in the tongues of humans, of men, or you speak even in the tongues of angels. I mean, super Christian, powerful in your walk seemingly with Christ, but you don't have love for one another, you are nothing more than the jingling cymbals of Aphrodite, emptiness, or the clanging gongs of fear. That's all you are. So we allow that to just land on us for a second here, because we're thinking people. We want to know the word. We want to have our theology in order. And yet he says, it doesn't matter how much you know. Knowledge is important, but it doesn't matter. All of your knowledge is nothingness if you don't have love. He goes on here. He's not just talking about our knowledge. I remember, God, I've got 3 kids, right? You guys know that. And Evie, my youngest, only biological child. And Spurgeon was born with this insatiable desire to watch television. He loves it, glued to it. You try to talk to him, there's no hope. Homework becomes marginalized in the face of the almighty TV. Evie was not born that way. She wasn't really, first couple years of her life, didn't really like TV. And finally, almost around the age of 2, she became fascinated with that Disney movie, Moana. It just come out. And in the movie, if you've seen the movie, Moana is a rebel. That's what Disney's trying to tell our children to be. And so she's a rebel against her father. And he said, do not go out in the water. I'm trying to protect you. And Moana wants to go out in the water. And so at one point in the movie, early on, she sings this song. And Evie would try, she was almost 2, so she would try to sing Moana's song with her. But the only part she could actually get out was, I know. That was it. And all the rest was just like jumbled phrases and words. But whenever Moana would get to this point, I know, Evie would sing that. And so I remember getting to that point of going, what do you know? Asking my 2-year-old, what do you know? And she just looked at me cockeyed, like not even understanding. And then she'd sing, I know. And I'm like, the answer is not much of anything. You're 2. You don't know much of anything. But as I was thinking back on that this week, my cute little girl, I thought of some not so cute Christians, myself included, if I'm honest, who go around seemingly with the mantra on our lips of, I know. And people are like, what do you know? And we don't know that much. I think Christian maturity is actually finding out how little we know oftentimes. How little we thought we knew everything, and now we're realizing how little we actually know. But Paul says, hey, it doesn't matter if you know a lot or you know a little. If you don't have love, it's inconsequential. You're a gong. You're a cymbal. Or, I've often divided the church, not just this church, but all churches, into 3 compartments, Christians into 3 compartments. We're thinkers, feelers, or doers. That doesn't mean we don't have parts of some of the others, but by and large, you look at your wife, you're like, oh, you're the feeler. And you look at your husband, and you're like, you're definitely not the feeler. You don't have any emotions whatsoever. You're the thinker, or maybe you're the doer. And those become exhibited in different denominational circles or in different churches. You have more of a feeling-oriented church or a thinking-oriented church or a doing-oriented church. Nothing wrong with any of that. But Paul's going to kind of address all of those here. Verse number 2. Or if I have the gift of prophecy and understand some of the mysteries, part of the mysteries. No, if I understand all the mysteries, all of them, and all knowledge, and if I have all faith, that word can be translated faithfulness as well. So if I am diligent, if no one can look at my life and find anything wrong with me, so that I can move mountains in my belief and in my faithfulness, but I don't have love, I am nothing. And if I give away all my possessions, and if I give over my body, you saw that in Acts chapter 2, right? So we're called to is to live sacrificially for one another. He says, if I give them all away, if I give over my body in order to boast or to be burned, and most likely this is a reference, what was happening in the Greco-Roman world under the Roman Empire was that if you were labeled a Christian, oftentimes in certain cities or territories, you would be branded. It was a painful process. You'd be branded, scarred for life. Some commentators say it could also mean like a pyre of execution, but most likely it's a branding. Either way, you're saying, I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to be branded for the cause of Christ. I'm willing to endure insult or marginalization or hatred or even death, imprisonment for the cause of Christ. And yet you don't have love. It doesn't matter. It's squat. Doesn't matter at all. I am nothing. I can give up my body to be burned. I can give all my possessions away, but I do not have love. I am nothing. So there's this obvious in the first 3 verses here, this necessary existence of love as people of grace. We'll keep going back to that. As people who have received the radical graciousness of Christ to us, it is absolutely necessary. So then we have to answer the question of what is love? And that's what Paul does for us here, right? The biblical essence of love is the second point here, verses 4 through 7. So he begins outlining it for us. Now, You might already know this, but in the Greek language of their day, this Koine Greek, there were 4 different terms for love. C.S. Lewis popularized this in his book, The Four Loves. But the first of those is storge. And storge was the familial love that exists between husband and wife, father and child, the affection that is there. It's even been compared to that of what a dog feels for their lover, for their owner, for their friend, for their best friend, for their world. That's how a dog would feel, is this storge love, this deep-rooted affection for someone, that they stir within us something that makes us happy. That's storge. A second form of love in the Greek is phileo. We get the city of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, which is anything but, right? But we get the city of brotherly love from Philadelphia, from the Quakers. But you have this idea of phileo. It's a friendship love. It's a commonality of interest that links individuals together. That's phileo. Then, of course, you have eros. We get erotic from that. It's a sexual love. It's the love that inflames, or means to engorge the hearts. It's a dominating love. It is a selfish love, a self-centered love. What can I get out of this? That's eros. Not necessarily bad in its proper context. And then you have, as you probably know, agape love, which, if I could summarize agape love, it is a compassionate, unwavering loyalty. And that's the word that Paul's going to use over. It's not storge. It's not like if you speak in the tongues of angels or of men, but you don't have storge, you don't have an affection for one another, you're nothing. It's not phileo. If you have all faith so that you can move mountains and you give up your body to be burned, but you don't have a brotherly commonality together, you're nothing. It's not eros. Thank God for that. That would be super weird if we all had eros for each other. It's agape. He's saying to us this morning, this needs to land upon us. We talk about the biblical essence of love. If you do not have, and let's just be honest, probably none of us do, but we should all be striving toward, for one another, yes, the easy to love people and the not easy to love people. Thankfully, they all go to different churches, and we're all easy to love, right? Right? That's how we like to see it anyway. Oh, I'm so easy to love. I know how hard I am to love. That's why I'm preaching this morning, because you guys have to love me. This is awesome. But if we don't have, we just say, I just want to check out, I'm going to love Allie, but I'm not going to love Mike. I'm going to love Joan, but I'm not going to love Mike over here. I'm going to love Aaron, but I'm not going to love Mike. There's a lot of Mikes here. Anyway, if we just say that, we can't pick and choose this. Like, I read a quote actually this week I was reading Putting Amazing Back into Grace, phenomenal book by Michael Horton. And he says this: the Church of Jesus Christ is not a collection of friends that you pick. It's a collection of brothers and sisters that he picks for you. That's rough news. That's a tough pill to swallow. Because if I was Jesus, I'd pick cool people, nice people, fun people, funny people. And he picks the most messy and broken and jacked up scumbags, including myself. And he's like, hey, love each other. If you don't, you're nothing. That's what we're called to. A compassionate, look, we've talked about this a lot. If we refuse to show compassion to one another, it is only ever because we think we are better than the person that we should be showing compassion toward. If we all realize how broken we are, and the ground, I know it's cliche, but the ground is truly level at the foot of the cross. And there's no leg up on each other. And that God has given us different gifts and different skills to show compassion and his grace to one another. We're going to talk more about that next week as well. But this compassionate, unswerving, that's inconvenience. So that means if someone says, I used to love, in reality, they never agape loved. Because it's an unswerving, it's an unfailing, it does not diminish, it's eternal in its application, loyalty to one another. That's tough. Now we start taking the test and we're like, I don't know if I've ever had that for anyone in my entire life. But the example before us obviously is Christ. And so he uses this word agape again and again to give us the biblical essence of love, but then he also begins to define it for us. So we'll look at it and define it as well. Verse number 4, love is patient. Dang it. Because we're not unique in this way. But it feels like more than ever before in the 21st century, We want it our way now. Even good things. When I share Christ with an unbeliever, I want maximum 12 minutes to go by before they receive Christ. Because discipleship and evangelism is too long suffering for many of us. But love, true love, is patience. Or literally the Greek word here is suffers long. Love is kind. That does not mean it's flimsy and frail and self-serving and always enabling, but it's kind. Agape does not envy. It's not wanting to be friends with somebody, wanting to shower love on them because you love them so much because of who they are. You almost envy their position. It's not that. It's not boastful. It's not trying to rally people to myself by having them observe how awesome I am. It's not arrogance. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily irritable and does not, keep a record of wrongs. So when we're this is what's really hard. This is what Jesus meant by the whole forgive 70 times 7, infinitely so. So when someone offends me, when I offend you, it is never you already did this once before. There's a spiritual amnesia that's almost called for. It does not keep a record of wrongs. Love finds no joy in unrighteousness. I read this week that love without truth is just sentimentality. So it does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things. That's talking about strength. It can be weighed down by. It continues on. It believes all things. Love is hopeful. Hopes all things. And it's persevering, endures all things. So, my two youngest kiddos came to me a few months ago. I was laying on the couch reading, and they came around the corner, and Evie was dressed up as Robin, and old school Robin, and but without, she still had pants on because we're Christians, so they didn't have the little tights. And then Justin was Lego Batman, so they're Batman and Robin. And I'm like, whoa, who is this here? And they're like, Batman and Robin. There was not 1 second where I thought it was actually Batman and Robin, right? Obviously, semi-intelligent on my part, but not 1 second. I knew who it was, but I pretended. This is Batman and Robin. And they pretend we are Batman and Robin. And they ran around the living room pretending and fighting with each other as Batman and Robin. The reason is I'm thinking about that this week and how cute that was in that situation, but how not cute it is in our situation. There is no word in the church, I believe, more abused and used as an empty masquerade than the word love. People say it all the time to be as rude or as hateful or as unforgiving as they possibly can. We've all heard it, and if we're just to be honest, we've all done it. I love you, but you've sinned too much. You've done too much. You've said too much. And I can no longer love as Christ, through Paul in 1 Corinthians 13, calls me to love. Look, I get it. I know what I'm called to. Jesus will understand. I've been treated too wrongfully, too much hate, too much scorn. Believe me, you guys know, I can stand here this morning and the antithesis to Christianity, the antithesis to what he's calling me to and us to, is to become bitter and jaded and use my theology and use my gospel and use my logic and use rhetoric and use love to justify unforgiveness and hate. And I think we do it all the time. And we'll hear people say, well, you know that they love you. I'll say, you know that I love you or I love them. But if I'm not meeting the definition of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 7, it's not love. It's really easy for us as a church to get onto our culture today because what they call love is not love, and it's not. Love is not toleration and acceptance of all things wrong. Love is truth. It's a lot harder for us to turn the microscope to our own hearts and our own souls and ask ourselves, not do I love the person across the room I barely know, not do I love the person who's treated me well, but do I actually love the brother or sister? You know what happens? I know because I've said it, I've heard you guys say it, so don't even pretend like you haven't, all right? We'll say, well, I don't know if they're really my brother or sister. As if that gives us an excuse not to love them anymore. Like, if the gospel of grace is the gospel of grace, then God has qualified a lot of messy and jacked up people that you might look at and say, oh, they're not really Christians because of their behavior. In essence, denying the gospel of grace. And meanwhile, our behavior would disqualify us every day, as Bunyan says as well. God's grace has been poured out upon us and broken and messy. I mean, it's not just cliche or cute to say broken and messy and jacked up and distorted. That's where we live. That's who we are. It is hard to agape one another. I'm not staying up here. I hope you guys get this. I'm not staying up there this morning as if I've conquered this, but this is what we're called to. This is a biblical definition of love for us. And then the final dimension that we see here is what I would call the eternal endurance of agape, of love. The word fail here, or ends, in verse 8, love never fails or love never ends. It was a term used for the seasonal change of when a leaf would relinquish its grip on a tree and fall to the ground. So that's the picture that Paul's painting for the Corinthians and for us. That true agape doesn't change. It doesn't last for a year or a decade. It perseveres on. Struggle, falter, fail. Look, none of this dismisses the atrocities that people have committed against you. None of it. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't mean that we ignore that we overlook that. But it means, like Christ, who great atrocities was committed against, we forgive. Love never fails. And he's going to give us some understandings here. What do we carry into eternity when this life is over? We don't carry our prophecies into eternity. Whatever that might mean. Most of the time, prophecy in Scripture just means a declaration of truth. Like, there's no reason anymore to declare truth, to be gospel ambassadors in eternity. I mean, we'll do it in song and praise, but to one another, calling one another to a deeper affection, devotion to Christ. There's no reason for that. That will cease. It will come to an end. Tongues, this gift that you long for, the tongues of angels, or tongues of that would need an interpreter, the tongues where I speak in one language, I'm heard in another. All three of those you see at different points in the book of Acts. But that will cease. There won't be a need for that anymore. Tongues was given to verify the message preached. Knowledge. It will come to an end because when you stand before, as we sang this morning, when we stand before our Jesus, Paul's going to say in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, we'll have the mind of Christ, we'll understand all things. Mysteries will be revealed. So that's going to stop. Like, we're going to stop learning at some point. And they use the analogy, when I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I put aside childish things. So he's basically saying this to the church of Corinth. He's saying it to us as well. And it's not very convenient. It's not very lovely. But he's saying, you think you're a man, you think you're a woman, but you're behaving like a child. Not because you don't know the stuff, or not because you're not exercising the gifts, but because you refuse to love. And you have all the excuses in the world why you shouldn't. Jesus had all the excuses, legitimately so, and still loved. When I became a man, I put aside childish things. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. But then face to face. For now we know in part. Then I will know fully as I am fully known. These three remain now. They're good. They're gifts, faith, and hope and love. But the greatest of these is agape. I was reminded this week of Stonewall Jackson, hero for the Confederacy in the Civil War, the American Civil War in the 1860s. And devout follower of Christ, Calvinistic believer, very quirky, eccentric guy. Earned that moniker, of course, the First Battle of Bull Run, where he refused to withdraw, and so he was there, and his brigade was there like a stone wall. 2 years went by, and he was the champion right-hand general of Robert E. Lee. And at the Battle of Chancellorsville, 130,000 U.S. soldiers descended on Chancellorsville, Virginia, upon 60,000 Confederate forces, outnumbered more than 2-1. And it was really the heroics and the brilliancy and the courage of Stonewall Jackson that led to this massive, monumental victory at Chancellorsville. But if you know the story, on the night of May 2nd, 1863, after a day of battle, a day of conquest, Stonewall Jackson and his men were returning to the Virginian lines, and a regiment of North Carolina soldiers mistook them for Union officers, Union soldiers, and opened fire. Many men wounded and killed. Many of the horses were killed, and Stonewall Jackson was shot twice in his left arm and once in his right hand, fell to the ground. He was taken into the tent and actually into a home eventually, his arm amputated, and 8 days later, contracted pneumonia and died from the complications of that. And Robert E. Lee stated that Stonewall Jackson, he famously said, Stonewall's lost his left arm. This is before he even had passed away in that interim period. And I have lost my right arm, and all because we mistook friends for enemies. And I said this a few months ago, and I'll say it again. You'll hear me say it over and over again. And this does not apply to anyone outside of these walls this morning. This applies to us. The Christian army is the only army in the world that shoots its wounded. And we should be better and more loving than that. God has not done that to us. He convicts us and he restores us. But he does not stop ever, does not waver ever in loving us. I'll finish this morning with another quote from Putting Amazing Back into Grace by Michael Horton. This is what he says to us. Ask yourself, is this me? Is this what he's called me to? And am I actually following? Horton says this: grace is the gospel. We know that. Hopefully we know that. We've been talking about it a lot all fall and into the new year. Grace is the gospel. We'll continue to talk about this. It's refreshing. The extent to which we are unclear about who does what in salvation is the degree to which we will obscure the gospel. So don't miss that. The extent to which you think you are 2%, 10%, 20%, 50% responsible. We might not say that because we're Protestants, we're gospel of grace people. But the extent to which we actually believe we're responsible will be the extent to which we obscure the gospel. At a time when moralism, self-righteousness, and self-help religion dominate in much of evangelical preaching, publishing, and broadcasting, we desperately need a return to this message of grace. We need to emphasize once again Paul's inspired commentary in Romans chapter 9. It is not, therefore, to depend on man's desire or effort, but on God's mercy. Our sense of purpose as individuals and as a church depends largely on how clearly we grasp certain truths about who God is, who we are, and what God's plan for history involves. Christians form a new humanity, a new spiritual race. Just as a rib was taken from Adam's side to create Eve, God has taken people from every tribe and language and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests to our God. This new race exists for a purpose. Listen, we exist for a purpose, a definite reason. It exists to receive, that's what we've been talking about, and then proclaim God's forgiveness and to make God's glory felt in a dark and drab world. So we've received it, Christ-centered, scripture-reliant, gospel-driven, and now community-focused. We turn toward those here and those outside the walls of this church as ambassadors of defined, biblical, God-honoring love into a dark and drab world. The challenge is before us. It's a significant challenge. It's difficult. It's not that difficult to read a book and learn some information. It's not that difficult, even, I would argue, to be faithful, especially in front of other people. It's difficult to love. That's what we're called to. Let's pray.